Carmine Lupertazzi Sr. has been granted a kind of nostalgic sainthood that would be impressive if it were earned, rather than simply repeated until it sounded true. The mythology insists he was the last immaculate old-school boss, unemotional, strictly commercial, allergic to vanity, and perpetually above the petty melodrama that consumes the younger men around him. That portrait is convenient, flattering, and, judging by the actual pattern of decisions attributed to him, wildly selective. The record is not the story of a serene executive gliding through a corrupt marketplace. It is the story of a leader who regularly confused stubbornness for strength, mismanaged the people closest to him, and left behind a succession problem so obvious it practically came with instructions. Start with the most charitable interpretation. Carmine Sr. is frequently described as all business. In theory, that means disciplined negotiation, relationship management, and institutional continuity. 3 areas in which he repeatedly showed a talent for lighting fires and then admiring the smoke. The Esplanade dispute alone undermines the legend. A boss who allegedly kept it 100% about business chose to dig in on a percentage split to the point that his own underboss came within minutes of arranging his murder for being unworkably irascible. That is not cool-headed leadership. That is a man so committed to being immovable that he nearly became a cautionary tale told at other people's funerals. Negotiation is not the same thing as refusing to negotiate until the last possible second, especially when the price of theatrical rigidity is an internal coup. And rigidity was not his only hobby. Carmine's approach to the New Jersey relationship is regularly framed as pragmatic partnership. Yet the cultural messaging he tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, worked directly against that supposed pragmatism. If the goal is stable business with a neighboring family, then training one's own people to treat that partner like an inferior nuisance is a strange way to do it. When a subordinate later invokes Carmine's era to dismiss New Jersey as a glorified crew, it reads less like one rogue opinion and more like an organizational habit. A boss who wants cooperation does not let his bench internalize contempt as policy. If the relationship is important, respect is not a decorative extra. It is the operating system. Then there is the matter of Carmine Jr., a walking reminder that nepotism is not a succession plan. It is a liability with a family name. Carmine Sr. gave his son access and influence that exceeded his competence, and he did it without the guardrails that might have made the arrangement survivable. It is not merely that the heir was unqualified. It is that the father made no serious effort to either develop him into a credible successor or contain him as a permanent non-factor. The result was predictable: a vacuum at the top, multiple ambitious lieutenants, and a civil conflict that could have been mitigated, if not prevented, by something as radical as clarity. Even a criminal enterprise benefits from basic governance. The most biting detail is how casually Carmine Sr. undermined his son's legitimacy in private while empowering him in public. Telling Carmine Jr. that a rival would be a son to be proud of is the kind of remark that accomplishes nothing except to destabilize one's own household. It is a small, needling cruelty disguised as candor, and it reveals a blind spot the pure business legend tends to ignore. Carmine Sr. could be petty when it suited him. A leader who cannot manage his own family dynamics has no right to be celebrated as a paragon of emotional discipline. The handling of Johnny Sack during the Ginny Sack-Ralph incident is another exhibit in the case against the Carmine as Zen master narrative. On the surface, Carmine is right about the underlying economics. Murdering a major earner over a joke is bad business, and bad business is an excellent way to turn power into paperwork. The problem is not the conclusion, it is the manner. Carmine's posture in that exchange reads less like wise restraint and more like deliberate humiliation. He treats Johnny's outrage as though it is either idiocy or hysteria, refusing to acknowledge the real subtext. The insult was not a literal proposition. It was a public degradation. And Johnny's fury was never about the fantasy of selling a spouse for money. Carmine's feigned confusion functions as a tactic to make Johnny look irrational while Carmine looks reasonable. It is clever, perhaps, but it is not cost-free. Publicly dressing down an underboss in front of business partners is not staying above emotion. It is a choice to manufacture resentment and then act surprised when resentment becomes ambition. At this point, the defenders arrive with the familiar argument. The absence of a named successor was not negligence, it was strategy. Naming a successor early, the reasoning goes, diminishes the current boss's leverage and risks turning him into a ceremonial figure, respected in title, ignored in practice. In an organization of violent opportunists, clarifying the future can invite the future to arrive sooner than scheduled. There is logic here. Power in such systems depends on uncertainty, and a clear air can become both a rallying point and a threat. In that sense, Carmine's reluctance to crown anyone might have preserved his authority while he lived. But a strategy can be simultaneously rational and destructive. Even if the refusal to name a successor kept Carmine's seat warm while he occupied it, it still left an institution without continuity. And the particular alternatives, an underboss with pride issues and a biological heir with credibility issues, were not problems that improved with time. Postponing the confrontation did not eliminate it. It simply ensured that the confrontation would occur in the worst possible context, immediately after the boss's death, when grief is currency, paranoia is policy, and every ambitious man interprets uncertainty as opportunity. If that was the plan, it was not brilliance. It was a slow-motion handoff to chaos. Another defense leans on the scoreboard. Carmine died of natural causes, at an advanced age, while avoiding prison and avoiding assassination. In this genre of career path, that outcome is treated as proof of superior intelligence. Fair enough, survival is a metric, yet it is an incomplete one. Some men live a long time because they are excellent leaders. Others live a long time because their rivals are temporarily more incompetent than they are. Dying in bed does not automatically mean a boss was wise. It means he was not removed earlier. That is a distinction worth preserving for the sake of accuracy, if not romance. The same selective reverence appears in the insistence that Carmine Sr. was uniquely CEO-like, always thinking 5 to 10 years ahead, dispassionate, patient, and capable of turning delayed gratification into a weapon. The example often cited, a story about leaving an offender alive for years to keep earning before eventually killing him, does suggest a certain cold calculation. It also suggests something less flattering, a worldview in which human beings are merely revenue streams until they are liabilities. That may be effective in the short term, but it is not the managerial virtue some admirers want it to be. It is simply the efficient administration of cruelty. Calling that leadership is possible, calling it greatness is an aesthetic choice. The most revealing debate attached to Carmine's legend is the argument over whether he knew various people, Paulie, Ralph, and the broader cast of New Jersey players. On one level, the question is absurd. A New York boss with long tenure would have at least some knowledge of the made men operating in a neighboring family, particularly one with which New York conducts regular business and shares governance structures. Pretending otherwise strains credibility. The more interesting claim is not that Carmine lacked awareness, but that he weaponized etiquette, acting as though he did not recognize a lower-ranking figure in order to reinforce hierarchy and deny a small man the dignity of equal footing. That interpretation is consistent with both protocol and temperament. In that world, introductions are not casual, they are controlled. A soldier who introduces himself directly to a boss, especially while name-dropping a mutual superior, invites a deliberate snub as a lesson in order. This is where Carmine's business-only persona becomes, again, less saintly and more transactional. If he did recognize Polly, and if Polly was quietly feeding information that undermined his own family, then acknowledging him publicly would be inconvenient. The best solution is simple. Treat him as disposable utility, useful trash, unworthy of recognition, and certainly unworthy of respect. That is not a moral stance, it is an organizational one. Betrayal is tolerated when it is profitable, and disowned when it is visible. The Carmine mythology also bleeds into broader questions about succession across families. Why bosses like Carmine Sr. and Jackie Aprile avoided naming heirs. The cynical answer is also the correct one. Once a successor is declared, the current leader becomes less necessary. Business partners start cultivating the future, rivals start planning the transition, and the heir himself gains a motive to accelerate the timeline. In legitimate corporations, this is managed through boards, contracts, and laws. In a confederation of criminals, governance is enforced with fear, and fear does not come with quarterly reporting. Naming a successor can be read as weakness, and weakness is an invitation. Yet the practical impact remains the same. Refusing to clarify succession externalizes the cost. The problem is conveniently deferred until after death, when the deceased can no longer be inconvenienced by the consequences. That is a recurring theme in these leadership styles. Decisions framed as strategic often look suspiciously like decisions designed to protect a leader's ego and comfort while transferring risk onto everyone else. It is not that the logic is absent, it is that the incentives are transparent. These incentives also explain why Johnny Sack sought Tony's participation in removing Carmine Sr. during the peak of their dispute. The request was not merely about eliminating a stubborn boss. It was about engineering a narrative. A hit carried out by New Jersey offers a clean scapegoat, plausible motive, and a powerful, unifying rallying cry afterward. It also creates a pretext for retaliation, consolidation, and potentially an expansion of New York's influence over New Jersey under the banner of justice. In political terms, it is a textbook use of an external enemy to cement internal authority. In business terms, it is hostile takeover logic with gunpowder instead of paperwork. That Johnny did not simply handle the job himself is not a mystery. It is risk allocation. If the fall guy can be outsourced, it should be. Better still, if the fall guy is already in conflict with the target and belongs to a smaller organization that can be disciplined without triggering an internal civil war in New York. The proposal is not subtle. The only subtlety is how many people pretend it is merely personal. The internal struggle that followed Carmine's death, Johnny Sack versus Carmine Jr., continues the same pattern: ego dressed as entitlement, and entitlement dressed as legitimacy. Johnny's belief that he was owed the top seat after years of loyalty is psychologically understandable and organizationally corrosive. Carmine Jr.'s emergence as a claimant reads, initially, less like ambition than manipulation. Advisors and captains seeking leverage saw a pliable figurehead with a famous surname and used him as a vehicle for their own advancement. That is how weak successors are manufactured, by people who do not need them to be competent, only useful. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that Carmine Jr. was not entirely without instincts. He lived in relative insulation, lacked the appetite for sustained brutality, and seemed surprised by how quickly the rhetoric of respect becomes the practice of killing. When violence escalated, particularly after the murder of a respected figure close to him, the limits of his commitment became clear, and he chose retreat over escalation. That retreat is often used as evidence of incompetence. It can just as easily be read as the rare appearance of self-preservation and situational awareness in a world that punishes both. This is where the appraisal of little Carmine becomes more nuanced than the jokes at his expense. His speech is littered with misused references and mangled anecdotes, which invites easy dismissal. Yet scattered among the verbal wreckage are flashes of something more valuable than cleverness, an ability to read incentives and recognize when pride is masquerading as strategy. The comparison between raw intelligence and practical wisdom is instructive. Some men can recite slogans about power. Fewer can recognize when the slogans are being used to steer them into a grave. Carmine Jr. often sounded ridiculous, but he occasionally landed on the correct conclusion, especially about the dangers of outshining a stronger rival and the long-term cost of pursuing dominance as theater. Even the idea that Carmine Jr. functioned as an allegory for a personable but underwhelming heir to a highly competent predecessor fits the broader pattern. Inherited prestige, questionable aptitude, and a political ecosystem eager to use the heir as a symbol. Whether or not the allegory was intentional, the dynamic is familiar. A hyper-competent sociopath builds an empire. The successor inherits the costume and discovers that the costume does not come with the skills, which returns, inevitably, to Carmine Sr. If the goal is to assess leadership rather than recite folklore, the verdict is less romantic and more irritatingly human. Carmine Sr. was not an enlightened OG immune to emotion. He could be stubborn to the point of self-endangerment, careless in how he treated key lieutenants, and negligent in institutional planning. He tolerated contempt toward critical partners while claiming to value business stability. He empowered an heir without preparing him, then left succession undefined and acted as though the resulting violence was someone else's problem. He handled disputes with tactical cunning and strategic short-sightedness in the same breath, mistaking humiliation for control and control for loyalty. And yet the legend persists because, compared to the men who replaced him, he often looked like a professional. He was less impulsive than those who killed over wounded pride, sexuality, or sentimentality. He did not confuse personal grievance with organizational necessity as frequently as others did. He displayed patience when patience was profitable. In a landscape where many leaders behave like insecure performers auditioning for their own myth, a man who reliably prioritized revenue will always be mistaken for a philosopher king. The more accurate assessment is less flattering but more useful. Carmine Sr. was not a paragon. He was a competent predator who occasionally overplayed his hand and benefited from operating in an ecosystem of worse alternatives. He understood that money was the point, and he rarely forgot it. That alone makes him look extraordinary in a world where men routinely torch fortunes to soothe their egos. But understanding the point is not the same as leading well. It is simply the minimum requirement for competence, dramatically elevated because so many others failed to meet even that standard. If the nostalgia must have a conclusion, it should at least be honest. Carmine Lupertazzi Sr. did not represent a lost golden age of disciplined leadership. He represented the same messy reality dressed in better manners. Sharp enough to survive, flawed enough to endanger his own position, and self-interested enough to leave the hardest problems unresolved so they would detonate after he was gone. In that sense, the myth is correct in only one way. He truly was old school. He simply was not the kind of old school anyone should be eager to romanticize.